Welcome to the Micromobility Podcast. I'm Prabin Joel Jones, your host. I have another exciting episode today for you. But before getting into that, a quick announcement. We announced Micromobility Europe recently. This time it's going to happen in Berlin on 2nd and 3rd of June. So mark the dates. If you haven't got your tickets yet, go to micromobility.io and get your tickets. For speakers, we probably will close the registrations much earlier than before. So if you want to speak at the event, please send in your speaker request much earlier. With that, let's get into today's episode. So today I have the OG host of the show, Horace Dediu. He is the co-founder of Micromobility Industries, and he doesn't need an intro. I had the pleasure of working with him at a company called Bond Mobility, and now with Micromobility Industries as well. And it's been such a pleasure, learning from him, working with him. And if you go back to say 2018 time frame when I got into the industry, my co-founder and I, Cedric, and I, we used to listen to the podcast where Horace would talk to Oliver, and that was kind of our learning journey, right? And I'm not alone. It's the same for many in the industry as well. So I'm extremely happy to have Horace on the show today. Welcome to the show, Horace.
Well, thank you, Prabin. It's always great to see you. And you say you learned a lot from me, but I learned a lot from you, and I learned a lot from our audience as well. Um, I mean, it's not been a sort of a lecture, knowledge transfer here. It's been a conversation. So we've had our ups and downs, but it's great to be back, and it's great to revisit some of these topics as we moved into our seventh, eighth year now, I guess.
Absolutely. I was listening to the very first episode. I don't know if you remember the episode with Oliver where you were introducing the concept of micromobility. So you were putting a weight class to it and all that, right? I was wondering. So did that definition change? Given the fact that we have a lot of new audience, can you define micromobility again for us?
That's a great question. And I probably have been thinking about this for all these years, almost every day, if not every couple of days, because it's such a foundational question. I mean, what I think the reason we started was because I discovered, let's say, the need for a term, and the term had to exist. Now, the fact that it happens to be this term, micromobility, I think it's a convenient term. It may not become the term of the future. I'm very happy to see it super, superseded by something better, but it's in the same sense as microcomputer. When it was invented, the idea of a very small computer was a very, they had to have a word for it, and eventually it became the PC. But the PC only came when IBM introduced a product called the IBM PC. Before that, there was the Apple PC, but it wasn't called that. It was called the Apple IIe, and there were a multitude of others, Atari and Tandy, which was probably forgotten now. There are a lot of little startups that did computers of that kind. Home computers maybe sometimes was used as a term. The reason microcomputer came out was because it first it was based on the microprocessor, which itself was a sort of the processor, the thing, the brains of the computer used to be on a big board, and many chips were involved, and then one chip was made, and this was made actually by Intel. And then Intel had to sort of use this term. I don't know who invented microprocessor,
Mhm.
and therefore who invented microcomputer, but it's a term that had to exist for a number of years, and it still does technically. That is what it is when you're using a personal computer. Um, but it's in many ways what happened was that a, a, a trademark or um, a term of art for the industry became more common than its technical definition or its technical name and term. Same with smartphone. We started with smartphone very early in like the late
Yeah.
90s to describe better phones that had more compute power in them, which weren't very popular at all. They were just bulkier and somewhat more complex to use. But eventually, smartphone became a category within the mobile phone industry. And now all phones are smartphones, so we don't have to use the term smartphone anymore. And I struggled. I remember in the early days of smartphones, I had to explain that I was working at Nokia. And I had to explain not just to our own people, but to people outside of Nokia who often were asking, what is a smartphone? And we struggled a long time to sort of, I remember, by the way, my definition of a smartphone was a phone that ran an operating system that allowed third-party applications to run, and you could get technical about it, to run in a protected mode so that
Yeah.
a single application couldn't crash the entire a computer or phone. And the fact that these early smartphones ran operating systems based on desktop operating system, which was Linux, you could get into the weeds easily into defining it from an operating system point of view. But it was technically a correct definition. But most people were like, "Oh, it has a camera," or "Oh, it has, you could play games on it." So these
Hmm.
are the kind of definitions that people were, in terms of what does it mean for the consumer to have a smartphone. Um, Nor did it matter really to the consumer what does it mean to be a personal computer or a microcomputer. It was just a computer. So over time, the characterization of the thing really became a moot point because either we got a term of art
Yeah.
or industry, or we ended up with a basically a non-essential everything was that thing, so it wasn't no longer necessary to identify it with a prefix. It was just a phone or a computer, not a personal computer or a microcomputer. It's just a computer and phone. We have those categories today. Nobody has any questions as
Hmm.
what they are. However however you have to, in the beginning of an industry, you have to define it somehow.
Yeah.
So here's there's another thing that comes to mind, and I remember, is that important things are difficult to define. And this is true of, the most important things in life. Love or even wealth
Yeah.
or power. We can't define these things. We don't know how to really get everybody on board or what that means. So first of all, I'm going to disclaim that my definition is A, irrelevant, B, probably going to be changed, and C, impossible. So let's start with that. Um, but here's my definition as I recall it from 7 years ago. It was that it's any mode of transport, and that is basically any machine, except
Yeah.
there's one mode that has no machines, and that's walking.
Hmm.
But there's usually a machine involved, so it's a mode that whose vehicle weighs less than 500 kilograms. And that's it. I
Okay.
tried to, and I argued at length about this with a lot of people who said it's absolutely wrong. But the reason I chose it, let me explain the reasoning. The reason I chose it is because I knew that no car could be made for with that weight less than 500 kilograms. Even though historically it was possible, it was no longer possible
Yeah.
to make cars weigh 500 kilograms or less. And there's many reasons that we can talk about an hour about why that is. So my point was to exclude cars.
Hmm.
So anything above cars, obviously buses and airplanes and trucks and everything else. So anything below 500 actually gave us a huge buffer to the next car. It was probably even like another few hundred kilograms before it to get to the car.
True.
So still a question, if you're going to go by weight, what sits in the 500 to 1,000, let's say, that sort of middle zone that I'm not covering.
Hmm.
But even at 500 kilograms, incidentally, if you'll permit me to sort of go again a little bit on the side note here, but that car that did exist at 500 kilos was actually the Fiat 500,
Hmm.
and the Fiat 500 is an iconic vehicle.
Yeah.
It was actually introduced at just about 500 kilograms. I think it got heavier later, but basically when it started in 1955 or so, it was 500 kilos, and we could not make a Fiat 500 anymore. It's one of those things that we'll go back in history and ask ourselves, when did we lose the ability to make vehicles like
Yeah.
that? And that's an interesting question. So anyway, so 500 kilos, and here's why people push back. Number one, obviously, if you're in the scooter business, this seems outrageously heavy. If you're in the mini car business, or if you're in the like the four-wheelers, what I call now heavy micromobility, they felt that maybe that limits their ability to grow into a little bit heavier,
Uh-huh.
a more let's say micro car. So there's sort of a little bit of a pushback at the extremes between 0 and 500. Um, and also the pushback, if I recall from other people, was that it didn't specify electric drive versus
Yeah.
petrol or diesel. It wasn't or human power.
Yeah.
It didn't specify power at all. Um, so there are people who wanted to categorize it as, well, it's electric. Okay, then you can use that. You say electric micromobility. Then you can
Yeah.
say, oh, it's shared or not, and then they get the business models or other things that you can attach to that. I mean, like in even the personal computer, it was network based, or it was standalone, or a server, all these other categories, again, subcategories. So just repeating again, 500 kilos. Why? Now, would I stick with this today?
Uh-huh.
Over time, I've kind of gone back and forth as to whether I should have abandoned it, because nobody really ran with it.
Yep.
And if you were to probably look it up in the Wikipedia now, that may not even be there. People
Uh-huh.
will say, well, it's just a class of small vehicles, or it'll say, oh, these are the categories included. And that's another thing. We could just say micromobility is skateboards plus, longboards plus uh, um, bicycles plus scooters plus, and
Yeah.
then you start to rattle off all the categories you can think of, and then forget that there might be categories coming up that you haven't thought of yet. Um, as we talked with Will Wolfgang, what do you
Yeah.
call a vehicle that's half motorcycle, half enclosed? It's got happens to have three wheels. It's electric drive, but it leans into corners. Um, so another thought I had over the years was like, oh, it's just a vehicle that leans into corners versus one that doesn't. And that's
Uh-huh.
actually a very interesting distinction from a physics point of view, because when you have something that leans, like the same question exists with boats. There are some boats that could kind of lean into turns, and
Yep.
those who don't. And then you have boats versus ships and that distinction. So bottom line is, it's kind of micromobility, like I said, is kind of what you want it to be.
Uh-huh.
Fundamentally, however, it's not cars. And we have to be
Okay.
clear that it is distinct from automobility.
Uh-huh.
So one other way to do it is like the negative space around the car, which is sort of a designer's term. Like, if you see a car, you look around it, what else do you see? That's where your micromobility is.
Yep.
That's one idea. But the fundamental question of like, it's not automobility, okay? It's negative automobility,
Uh-huh.
whatever. Um, I think it captures the point I'm trying to make, and the reason the word exists, which is to say that we have a lot of attention paid to mobility as automobility,
Yep.
and 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 bigger, and we don't pay attention to the little options that exist beneath that. And I said, let's unify those options together
Uh-huh.
and look at them as a whole. And the idea, therefore, isn't so much to iterate and enumerate and sort of specify what each one of those little options are, but rather to say that together they're bigger than automobility,
Yeah.
or will be bigger. They have to be, because frankly, if you were to try to mobilize a whole planet, you can't do it with cars.
True.
And it will be the sort of the low end of mobility, turbocharged, if I may use a bad metaphor, but accelerated by electric drive, accelerated by urbanization, accelerated by the new optionality in terms of compute, which
Yep.
gives you the smaller form factor, which is more and more powerful and more interesting and more accepted by more and more people that couldn't cycle themselves or walk where
Yeah.
they wanted to go, and now they can use something else. So that's why it exists.
Where do you slot the new microcars? I'm talking about Citroën Ami Microlinos, where speed is capped at 45 kilometers per hour. In Europe, they're classified as L6E category, so essentially a moped. Uh, where do you put them? Because if you look at the weight,
Absolutely. That's
less than
exactly
5
the
kilograms, right?
why that's why I would include them. Now, this is where it gets fuzzy because, like, what if they get a big battery in them and somehow the weight goes over 500? Are they going to be automatically disqualified? No, this is
Yeah.
why 500 is more of a something that allows us to discuss the topic. As long as, again, taking the other definition, it's not a car. As long as it doesn't fall under the regulations, if you want
Hmm.
to use a regulatory lens, the definition as defined by governments,
Yeah.
that it requires a license, a driving license, requires insurance,
Hmm.
requires registration, requires taxation, and requires parking of a car. Now, if
Yeah.
you we could probably add to that list. It is covered by tariffs, as with a car, or whatever it is you want to add to the sort of regulatory burden that exists. Um, and I used to say, by the way, I used to say it's sort of the thinnest definition is the width of your driving license, because that's a
Hmm.
separating factor as well. Although again, a lot of these vehicles may require some licensing,
Yeah.
maybe not the same driving license that you need for a proper car. But the car industry has over a century carefully carved itself a definition, and as a result has sort of bounded itself by these requirements.
Yeah.
And the industry is very clear about it. But as you see now, this burst of innovation around electric mobility allows us to skirt around it. So a lot of innovators are actually thinking, well, how can I make a vehicle that has much of the functionality but is not a car? Because
Yeah.
then I can be much more innovative. I can be much more exciting. I can be much more, uh, let's say, jobs to be done. I can uncover new things that it can be used for.
Hmm.
And so in that sense, yes, those qualify because they're not cars. Now they
Yeah.
may have, again, a motorcycle type feel, and the speed limitation might be arbitrary and might be imposed by one government and then changed by another. So we
Hmm.
don't know if speed really is a. By the way, that was another thing I was getting feedback on. Let's make it based on speed. Like, why
Hmm.
would you want to limit it? What if, like, 20 years from now we get rid of cars in cities
Yeah.
and somehow say, oh, people are going to want to go a little bit faster. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's they definitely are qualified if they're not cars. That's how I
Yeah.
put it.
Yeah, limiting it by speed is also doesn't make much sense because on a mechanical bicycle you can really go fast as well if you look at cycling races, right?
Absolutely. Professional cyclists, or even not so professional, can
Yeah,
easily do more than 45 kilometers, especially if you're going downhill a bit. I mean, think
exactly.
about it. 45, if no one has done it, you can certainly buy a speed pedelec today
Yeah,
in Europe, and it'll do that under power. But again, cycling freely can get you there as well.
yeah. Do from your definition, there should always be a human in the loop? The reason why I'm asking is, but we also saw these delivery bots coming up. For example, Starship, even DoorDash came up with a bot. From a weight category point of view, speed point of view, it still falls under the definition. Just that there's no
I have
human in the
no
loop.
humans involved in that definition at all.
Yeah,
This again, it's about a conveyance. It's about a vehicle. If it's a vehicle that's happens to be driven by a machine,
yeah,
and I sort of take Waymo's point of view that what they do is they don't make cars, they make drivers.
yeah,
It happens not to be a human one. And if that driver, and I think that technology, that software will propagate to micro as well. In fact, in many ways, micro leads in robotics.
yeah,
Micro has one of the things that I used to say very, bear with me again. One of the things I used to say very often was that the ability of micro to iterate is much more rapid than the ability of automobility to iterate. And the reason for that is because it's the same evolutionary mechanism that exists in nature. Small things evolve faster than big things. It's why we use fruit flies to do our experiments for living things because they have short life cycles, and we can see the progression of whether they are, drugs or other
Yeah.
other RNA or DNA based mechanisms. They just go faster in small things. And what that lets you do, what's important is like because a smartphone, for example, has a shorter lifespan than a PC. Innovation in smartphones is more rapid than innovation in PCs or innovation in big computers. So the smaller it is, the more quickly it can be usually iterated, and that's another win. And that means you can inject software, and that software can evolve faster,
Yeah.
which is the essence of software.
On the Waymo topic, funny thing, because we are talking about the definitions. I don't know if you remember the first Google Pod, which was the
Yes,
first Waymo. I don't really know what the weight would be, but I'm guessing that it
I
should
think
be less than 500
pretty close.
kilograms, right? Yeah. So it's funny that it started with a micro form factor, and then now it's a Jaguar SUV, right?
And the Jaguar is electric, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have that much room inside, so that much more room inside.
Yeah.
I think and if you see the proposed robotaxi from Tesla, it's a two-seater. So
Mhm.
there's like a question of whether you do need more than that in a sort of a robotic driving vehicle or
Yeah.
a riding vehicle because there's a debate. Taxis typically are more than two seats, but
Yeah.
maybe they don't need to be.
Exactly. So going back to 2018, when you defined the term, you also had a thesis about how this industry would evolve, right? I mean, when we were listening to what you were speaking at that time,
Yes.
it was very clear that this industry is going to grow in a massive way, and it did happen. If you look at 2018, 19, 20 timeframe, it did grow, right? Looking back, what are a couple of things that you got right? And second, what are some things that surprised you?
Yeah, great question. So, two couple of things. There's been what I call a swing of the pendulum, where we could talk about it as cyclicality, um, that has occurred in the various indicators of progress or success. One would be in terms of vehicles sold or miles or kilometers
Yeah.
served, or consumed. I don't know how to put that. But the thing that we've experienced in the last 7 years is we've had COVID. We've had so I think we've had uh, something unforeseen in terms of a global pandemic, which has kind of caused a lot of perceptions to swing back and forth. So we went from a certain amount of enthusiasm, a certain depression, and then a recovery, and then maybe a stabilization afterwards, and that's just like in the bicycle business.
Yeah.
Um, in sharing, we've had issues with capital. So capital was over enthusiastic, then it was under enthusiastic, then they may be coming back because we're
Yeah.
seeing productivity and we're seeing profitability. So what's difficult to predict, even if you can connect the dots to sort of figure out that the future is clearly steady in one direction, you don't see that sometimes the capital and it was like enthusiasm or sentiment tends to swing much more broadly
Mhm.
than what the normal dots would indicate would be an acceptance or a adoption curve. And and also on political things, same thing. We had people who were, uh, a car centric, then they became much more positive on accepting micro into cities to the extent that they were gating factors. They would sort of like open the gates, then they close them, then they maybe open them again. So all of this happened in 7 years. We've
Yeah.
seen the swing happening in extreme cases on vehicles and therefore in manufacturing supply chain. We've seen it on capital, and we've seen it in regulation, and we've seen it on a pandemic, or sort of like what the heck could we have done there? Um, and the other thing is, I think that the human tendency to kind of be short term is that we've also seen that on climate. Um, I remember thinking back a few years ago about Al Gore's famous film,
Mhm.
An Unconvenient. Inconvenient Truth. That took that came out like 17 years ago, if I remember, something like that.
Mhm.
So when it was 15 years old, we looked at it, and myself and uh, Kevin from uh, Relay
Really.
Ventures,
Yeah.
Kevin Talbot, who I still we still work together. Um, if you look at that swing, the climate picture went from 2005 or so, it was like panic, and then investments in solar and other alternative energy, then a certain reactionary movement, meaning let's ignore that and call it a fake, then swing again.
Yeah.
Um, and so now we're in this weird phase where, in many ways, the data is worse than ever. We've crossed the 1.5-degree threshold, but politically it seems like there's no appetite to do anything. Well, there's still in some parts of the world, and there's huge progress on energy in production in solar, and but at the same time, consumption due to AI is just catastrophically high,
Yeah.
and then there's a sort of a regressionary movement in the U.S. towards more internal combustion. But generally, the trend is in the right direction. But I'm just
Mhm.
saying that businesses often live or die by very, very small changes in a highly volatile thing.
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't judge the idea of micromobility on the success of individual companies, because, by the way, we've seen 1,000 flowers bloom,
Yeah.
but also like probably 900 flowers perish, which flowers do, by the way. That is their nature. So the growing into a tree is a whole different matter than sort of just growing as a flower, and
Yeah.
that's another story to be discussed. I mean, the economics, the physics, all these things. There are some things which are predictable, and some things are less predictable. But when you tie it to human sentiment, you tend to be very vulnerable. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I would say we couldn't have foreseen, although maybe I wasn't trying to so much foresee that this would succeed as an economic thing. Well, forgive me if I did try, but I shouldn't
Mhm.
have. But it's there were indicators that were very positive early on. The number of miles driven or ridden, I should say,
Yeah.
and that was data coming out of the sharing companies, and there was a certain numbers of vehicle production out of China, which were astronomical, which kind of maybe were false indicators.
Yeah.
The amount of capital as well was probably a bit of a head fake, but overall, I'll say this. And this was by the way, a tough period during COVID because we didn't know anything would survive that
Yeah.
period, but we did survive. One of the things that I would go back and look at is, you do you still see people on scooters? Do you still see e-bikes? Do you still see more sharing happening? And my as a resident in Europe,
Yeah.
I see it even more than I used to.
Absolutely.
I see it in my hometown. I see it in towns I visit, and there's although it's gone quiet in the mainstream media, there's still a lot of activity in micro.
Yeah.
It just hasn't maybe it is probably in that nice productive space as opposed to the hype space, and that's what I would say is the current
Mhm.
status of the
Yeah.
industry. Is like it's alive, it's persisting, and it's growing.
Yeah. Um, if you look just 1 or 2 years as a time frame, probably that's not the right measure. Like you said, look back at 2018 versus where we are today. I strongly see a massive progress. Cities transformed completely. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Paris recently, or even London. It's a very different city compared to 2018, right? I mean,
Absolutely, and
yeah,
it's not just the major cities. That's my point. Yes, I've been to those, although maybe not London. It's been a few years, but
yeah,
Paris definitely. But if I go to the small towns, if
yeah,
I go to middle of Finland, if I go to southern Spain, I can tell you that the number of people and individuals I see on scooters or e-bikes is jaw-dropping. I used to say, look at women riders, look at children or youngsters or elderly. These are outside of the core. Look
Yeah.
at these outliers, and if you see, especially women on modes that are new, then you know you're winning. Um, it used to be said of bicycles overall 120 years ago,
Yeah.
measure the progress by the number of women using it. And you know you have a healthy ecosystem if they are present. So in this case, I saw not just women, I saw women with children, and that's crazy. But to think a woman with a small child holding on to her on one scooter. I've seen four youngsters on one scooter at the same time, which is improbable. And this is a shared
Yeah.
scooter, and I know it violates all the rules,
Yep.
but it shows what people are doing. I've seen scooters used for all kinds of stuff. I've seen food delivery people not on so much scooters, but on two-wheelers
Yeah.
everywhere here in Helsinki. I see them every day and never existed before. They enable the whole food delivery industry to occur. I've seen young people going to sporting events on scooters, like a after school type of activity. I've seen them go to school and from school, etc. So
Mhm.
obvious things, but it's more and more of this, and I notice it because, of course, I'm liable to notice it, but also
Yeah.
I see e-bikes. I see elderly couples cycling together to vacation spots, which couldn't have been done without electric bikes. And you also can see that outside of a nice establishment, you'll see two identical e-bikes parked locked together. You know there's an elderly couple involved. And that's just so sweet and so nice to see, right? And these people are reclaiming maybe their youth, or maybe they're
Yeah.
just enjoying life together in retirement. But think about that.
True.
What other mode would let you do this sort of thing? And so there's heartwarming stories, and that's in my personal observation, away from the big towns.
Yeah.
And so I think you multiply that by 50,000 just to think about what's happening just in Europe because of all the towns that exist. So definitely it's a success story, but it's one that, as always, runs beneath the radar. It's
Yeah.
just not talked about much.
Exactly. I was with Ryan, the founder of Jump, in Paris a couple of months ago, and in fact, on the first episode, you mentioned about Uber acquiring Jump at that time. So Ryan and I, we were like, we took a bike, went around Paris, and we were chatting, and something that was fascinating is that when he was building, then it was a struggle because it was very difficult to convince cities and people to adopt to this
Mhm.
new mode. And now when you look when you look at Paris or London, it's fully filled with Lime bikes, right? I mean, the
Yeah,
bikes that Ryan helped build. And in fact, what's funny is that probably what the value that Uber assigned to those assets when they offloaded to Lime probably is like much lower than the revenue that Lime is making with these bikes today every year,
amazing. And
right?
I didn't know that. I met Ryan, but I forgot that story when thinking about yeah, what's on the street. It's remarkable.
Yeah,
And Paris, by the way, if you haven't had a chance, it's just been an amazing story to see how that's gotten transformed.
exactly.
Especially as bike sharing has been banned there for for very disturbing reasons, I would say. But um, I yet people are taking that micromobility so to heart there. It is so
Yeah,
natural now. And it just the famous Rue de Rivoli, I think it's called. It's a road that goes east to west right by the
the
Louvre,
Louvre. Yeah,
right north of it, and there's a fairly long stretch of maybe a couple of
yeah,
kilometers up to Place de la Concorde. I think that's the boulevard that now has been turned over almost exclusively to cycling, and it's such a joy to travel that route because it's quiet.
yeah,
It has got this serenity about it, and although there's one lane I think for cars,
yeah. Just one lane. Yeah,
yeah, but they are subservient almost. They're like, it's so nice to it's not like we're excluding cars. It's like it's a metaphor almost. Like
yeah.
you are okay to be here, but you cannot dominate. So for that reason, it just feels natural. And it's a bit scruffy. It's not as nice as the Nordics, in terms
Mhm.
of their infrastructure and especially interconnecting some of these uh, cycleways or I wouldn't even call them lanes.
Yeah.
They're sort of highways almost. To each other, it's a little bit still rough at the edges, but Paris has changed so much, and it's a joy to be there. If you ever go, either rent or I wouldn't say necessarily buy, but if you can
Get a
rent a
bike. Yeah.
bike,
Yeah.
it's the way to do it now.
Yeah. And then we have a lot of operators right now. So we have Lime, we have Dot, we have Voi that launched a month ago as well. So there's plenty of options, right? Same with London as well. I haven't spent a lot of time in London, but I'm hoping that I can go to London just to experience what's going on there, right?
It's both. These are old cities that existed before the car.
Yeah.
The car is a newcomer, and in many ways, although the cities have tried to accommodate the car, in many ways, that too has been a pendulum. If you look at postcards, this is another thing I noticed in my journeys, if you will. If you get an old postcard, especially of Italian cities or towns from the 1960s or 70s,
Yeah.
and you see how the car took over those cities, and now if you see those cities today, you'll see a transformation where they used to have nowhere to park and they were all jammed into the main square. There's beautiful piazzas, which now are tourist areas, but they
Yeah.
used to be just literally parking lots. So already the car has kind of penetrated, bred and filled every crevice, and now it's been pushed back. It's been
Yeah.
pushed back because it doesn't make sense. And then now I think it's in the process of being pushed even further away, and slowly, without, it's not like a big bang. It's slow pressure.
Yeah.
If you want to see it in film, there's a film called from the 1960s called The Italian Job. It's
Okay.
actually a famous film if you're a car fanatic, because they use these minis to do a heist in Torino, Italy. These British uh, uh, gangsters or criminals, whatever, go to Italy to steal some gold. Okay, that's the premise of the movie. But in it, there's a lot of stunt driving in Italy as a result, using minis, which became kind of iconic as a as a story. But you see what it was like actually to drive and to see cars
Yeah.
in that town, which is a northern Italian town. And compared to today, the cars have gotten bigger, maybe even more plentiful, but they're not as sort of dominant in, if you will, in
Yeah.
terms of their impact. Also,
True.
don't forget back then they didn't have catalytic converters, so the smoke from the cars actually literally hurt you.
Yeah.
It stung your eyes. It was a smell, and it damaged your lungs. Constantly created acid rain, which damaged the buildings actually and the ancient architecture there.
Yeah.
So, anyways, long tirade, but the point
Yeah.
is that things are changing.
Yeah. Same in Brussels as well. I think, you were here in Brussels a couple of months ago for Micromobility Europe. If you've been to the center, which is called Grand Place, it used to be a parking lot, right? And
Mm,
and now it's like completely, it's a pedestrian zone, and even areas around it. It used to be a main road for cars to pass through the city. Right, I had like
yeah.
Martin Lafranc from Brussels City recently on the podcast. We were chatting about it, and now it's probably one of the largest pedestrian zones in Europe, right? So there's no cars,
Yeah.
and the city is completely transformed.
And it's happening around, like you mentioned, Rivoli, but it's like if you look at these large central areas, Barcelona comes to mind, but like if you go to Munich or
Yeah,
Berlin, and you see it hasn't happened like in a big bang way. Like I said, it's been slowly through regulation,
yeah,
through taxation, through congestion charging, through speed limits, and through parking, especially. If you, and I always used to say this is one of those mantras of micromobilities: as parking goes, so goes the car.
yeah,
There's no more dependence asset for automobiles than real estate, because it's a question of geometry. Cars take a lot of space and they're sitting 96% of the time. And another, again, asymmetric attack on the car is like, hey, I have a vehicle that consumes 1/5 or 1/8 of the space.
mhm,
And what does that do for mobility versus space requirements? And this is a space, by the way, which is the most valuable thing in a city right now in terms of asset value
Yeah.
is it's land, right? And so my point is that if you look and you see the dials being turned on all of these measures, right?
Yeah.
Speed limits are going to go to 30 kilometers across the board in Europe. It's already happened. Um, 30 kilometers an hour is, like we said, with 45 on a speed bike,
Yeah.
speed pedelec bike. Uh, it's certainly doable on a bicycle. And so that's all dialing and turning up the pressure on the car. And I think people will respond as they do usually gradually, but they'll respond with like, maybe this time I won't take a car into the city. I
Yeah.
live here in Helsinki and I never do it anymore. I would never take a car into the city because it's not that I can't, or it's like 6, 7 kilometers.
Yeah.
I can even walk this. Yeah, it's an hour and a half or so, but I would definitely choose anything but a car to get into the town. And fortunately, we have many options here, but the thing is that w- when you add 40, 50 euro for parking, well, or something to that effect,
Hmm.
um, and then having to even find that parking, it's just an extra cost that you don't want to have to deal with.
Yeah.
So that's why
Exactly.
we win. I always said at the end of the day, micromobility always wins.
Yeah.
And it may seem like you're kind of getting pushed out some places, but that's just a tiny aspect of micro. But yeah, you may have seen a political movement to ban scooters because of some elderly citizens' annoyance, and they vote a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, and that could last for a while, but then it's going to
Yeah.
come back. There were similar things tried to do with cars, and kind of they were pushed on. You know what I mean. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's. And the other thing, by the way, you have to deal with is a lot of people when I have these conversations. Well, what about public transportation?
Hmm.
And I'm not against public. I love public. I use it almost as much, and I would argue even to people who are very much against public transportation to say that if you fly, you're using public transportation. An airplane is a big bus in the sky. Um, the point about that is that it is not possible to address, again, from geometry reasons, to address any point to any point, right?
Yeah.
Random access of locations is not possible with a shared resource. Usually that is a shared vehicle that use more than one user, right? That's what I mean here in
True.
terms of shared. Um, they tend to be batch oriented as opposed to sort of like bits in a network.
Hmm.
Um, and as a result, it's kind of always good for trunk lines. It's always good for moving bulk of demand, but it isn't going to solve the last mile, as they call it. And
Yeah.
it's just geometry. It's a great thing to use together with micro, but it isn't enough by itself.
Got it. I want to move to another topic, which is also something that you introduced, which is called the job to be done framework.
Yeah.
Can you explain to the audience what that means?
So job to be done is not. I introduced it to micromobility and
Yeah.
to mobility, perhaps, but fundamentally, it's an idea predating. It's probably 25 years old, and it's a way to capture the question of why people buy things, and the normal way of approaching that is you ask what they want and you give it to them. But most people don't usually know what they want unless it already exists. So if you want to introduce something that doesn't exist yet, you have to ask what outcome do you want to achieve
Mhm.
if products existed. And so rather than saying so job to be done logic simply says you hire products or services to do things for you, and usually there's a very distinct purpose to your and it's not, be careful, it's not use cases, it's not I use a coffee machine to
Mhm.
make coffee. You should ask, why do you need coffee in the first place? What does coffee do for you? Is it the way it's packaged? Does it matter? Are you shopping for coffee once a week or once a month? Are you concerned about coffee being an energy or resource intensive commodity that possibly victimizes its suppliers? these are all jobs to be done versus I want to make coffee. That's a utility function. So the utility function of transportation, I want to go A to B.
Yeah.
A job to be done question about mobility is what do you want to do if you get to B, and would you rather go to C?
Mhm.
Is the getting there as important as the being there? In other words, is the journey as important as the destination? These are questions for mobility, because most people who do think about transport or mobility, they'll often just focus on economics. They'll just say we want to minimize the cost per mile. We want to say getting A to B should be an economic, rational decision based on minimization of cost, maximization of benefit. This is a sort of an economic rationality model for decision making, and it isn't.
Mhm.
People don't travel because they want to minimize cost of travel. They travel because they want to meet their lover. They want to help their parents. They want to get an education. They want to buy something which ultimately makes them feel better about themselves. These are the outcomes you hire transportation for.
Yeah.
And you might decide to do more of it or less of it based on these outcomes. So we invented things to do. We invented going out to restaurants. We also invented the idea of having the restaurant come with the food to you. So all of this is possible because of mobility. We invented cruising, and we invented getting to malls and hanging out at malls, because malls and highways exist to get us there. No one asks for these things, right?
Yeah.
So when you start to ask about the outcomes of mobility, then you create an opportunity to discover new consumption, which maybe some people don't want,
Mhm.
or maybe how to tune down consumption. Again, we went through this during the pandemic. It's like, do we really need to go to the office? Which is, by the way,
Yeah.
30% of all trips are commuting to work. Many people think it's like 100. No, it's 30. There's 60%, 70% of things that involve shopping and taking care of other people. So those censuses tend to do surveys on this. But
Mhm.
my observation is, like, when you think about jobs to be done and you segment mobility according to these jobs. So let's do it as an exercise. Okay,
Yep.
taking care of myself, taking care of others, acquiring things, and maybe I would say commerce is not a job, but it's like um, engaging in some form of money making activity. Let's say, a
Mhm.
little bit cynically, but yeah, there's automobile industry, by the way, is proud of the fact they say that every journey in a car ends in an economic transaction.
Mm.
And that's not just going to the gas station, by the way. But it's like you're going shopping or you're going to jobs.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going shopping and going to jobs, that means either you're earning money or you're spending money. And for that reason, the car should be worth paying for, because it's something happening at the end of that journey. But I would take that and run with it and say, well, hold on, what other things can we do with vehicles that make our lives better?
Mhm.
And it's not just these very, very primary things of making and selling, or making and buying or whatever. Um, it's like, okay, are there social jobs that we are possibly not doing? So, for example, young people have a job that maybe elderly people don't, which is,
Mhm.
well, maybe I would say middle-aged people don't, which is like, I want to make friends and I
Yep.
want to sustain my social network physically, my
Mhm.
physical social network. So some people say it's all going online, but there's still that need to connect physically.
Yep.
And by the way, that might swing as people become really burned out on social media. We might see a swing towards physical connections again. Um, so there's this possibility of uncovering new jobs for social jobs, and what I would say is micro is very well suited for that, because it allows you to make more trips than cars.
True.
Cars, generally speaking, this is one of the constants in mobility, is that we take about 3 trips a day. Now, naturally, you might say that doesn't add up, because it kind of has to be an even number. You leave, you come back, and leave and come back. So it has to be, but no, it's probably like you leave and come back to make 2 trips most days, but every other day you take 4. So
Mhm.
then it evens out to 3. And so, okay, so let's say 3 trips a day.
Mhm.
Now, why? There's a lot of friction in getting into a car and out of a car. We talked about
Yeah.
parking, but you get to the car wherever it is, and it has to be started and so on.
Mhm.
Whereas the friction to get onto and out of a micro might be almost negligible.
Yeah.
There's also cost, by the way, physically in terms of fuel and parking and traffic, which is a
Mhm.
time cost. But with micro, you reduce a lot of that. In that case, we might get to a higher frequency of travel. We might get to a lower cost as well, but we might get to a question also of distance. The Marchetti's constant suggests that we travel 1 hour a day. This has been historically kind of confirmed. But maybe it's not that we're going to travel longer time-wise, but we're going to
Mhm.
maybe make more trips within that time frame. And if that's the case, then we have the possibility to increase the fabric of
Yeah.
connective tissue of humanity. Not to mention non-consumption, which is people in parts of the world which have no cars and no public transportation, no motorization at all, in which case this option might be the first time to get any power to travel, which occurred in the wealthy countries about 120 years ago when people first got bicycles, not cars,
Correct. Yeah.
bicycles. So that unleashed a huge amount of mobility. And when you bring that technology to the world that doesn't have it today, doesn't have any mobility today, I think it could unleash entirely new consumption. So
Yeah.
I would imagine that firstly, because of jobs to be done thinking, we might see the number of trips increase. We might see the destinations that we go to increase. We might see non-consumption be unlocked, and we might see a future where people are far more likely to interact with each other.
Yeah.
And with technology, by the way, it's not you also have the possibility to have with maps software, but with potential wearable products, like you can imagine safety gear that is actually compute enabled. I always
Mhm.
talked about smart helmets being an opportunity as big as virtual reality. Um, you have the ability to sort of gain superpowers,
Yeah.
meaning that you're literally flying through space with ability to see through buildings, ability to be safer, and kind of decide what to do on a spontaneous basis and change your
Yeah.
destination in a spontaneous way. And by the way, that is another thing is when you start on a journey, you tend to not divert from that destination. But with micromobility and smart technology, you might end up on journeys where you start and you don't know where you're going to end up.
Yeah.
And yet be fun and productive at that. By the way, just quickly,
Mhm.
that's exactly how surfing ended up and the internet interface ended up because all it is just a bunch of computers on a grid, and we didn't have a notion of surfing or browsing.
Yeah.
We ended up going there because the technology allowed us to discover new things, and it redirected us through search to go to places we hadn't thought of going. So the whole internet, because of the business models of search being advertising driven and social media being advertising driven, when you think about those as the foundations of the entire technological space today, those were created basically on a redirection basis.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
is going to places you didn't intend to go online. Because I tell you, I was alive and using computers before the internet. And what was going on then is like you needed to know the IP address
Yeah.
of the server you wanted to go to, and you pulled files from it because that was the only purpose for networking. It was to like move files back and forth. And so they had to be a known destination and a known password to get there, and then you could use it properly. But with surfing, it's like, I don't know where I'm going.
Yeah. True.
Show me cool places to go and things to do and all that stuff. We don't do that in the physical world. We are so used to it in the online world
Mhm.
that it is the only thing we can think of doing
Yeah.
in online. And yet, when I try to point this out and say that in the physical world we don't do redirection, it's because oh well, it's either too expensive, we don't have monetization for that,
Mhm.
and people are set in their ways. All these reasons,
Yeah.
oh, we do the same trip every day. There's no reason for me to think of like going to a different place every day because I just go to one or two places. Those
Yeah.
are places I know. Well, that's just because that's all you have the ability to do. And
True.
if I gave you the option to do different things, you might end up doing different
Yeah.
things every day. and you might take a different path to work every day. And you
Yeah.
might say, my trip to work is as interesting as sitting on the couch and enjoying whatever entertainment I have. So like suddenly I'm gonna go do all these things. We dream about this. We think that that is the coolest thing. The serendipity, the discovery. We do it when we go on vacation. We go to places that we don't know, and we kind of go wandering around, discovering and magical things, and it's a wonderful experience. We pay a lot
Yeah.
of money for it, and you could do that in your own town. You
True.
could do that in your town, but you don't. And why don't you? It's because like, oh, it's routine. Oh, it's expensive. Oh, there's nothing new. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
that can all be exploded by micromobility, and that's why I'm saying it's not the mode itself. It's like what it unlocks, and then you only get there by kind of asking a few profound questions of what do we actually do here?
Yeah. A quick thing on the physical connection and all that. Micro mobility enabling it. I was fascinated by data that came out from Lyft that a big portion of their rides is leisure rides. So it's like two friends just taking Lyft bikes and just biking around, right? So that's one.
Exactly, and so
Yeah.
what I used to say is watch for behavior change and watch for language change.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, one of the things is that we when we create vocabulary, we tend to do it because we are creating new jobs. And so in the case of cruising, I'm going to use automotive language that has been created. Cruising and uh, uh, the sort of notions of either racing or doing something competitively with cars. Um, uh, and going to, in the old days, like to movie theaters and things like that, with your significant other, all these things, so romantic things and shopping things, all driven by the technology. And like going to IKEA it's a day out for a lot of people here in
Yeah.
Europe, and enabled by the hatchback, by the way, as a technology. The when you listen to young people and ask what are they doing, and they're sort of like, if they're going to come up with new language to describe the trip, then it's exciting. And also destinations that might change. And I remember during the cycle boom in China, the shared cycle boom, which by the way they're still using shared cycles in
Yeah.
China, but it's not in the news. But at last I heard it was like 400 million rides a day in China
Wow.
in shared mobility. Um, the idea was that young people would get away on sort of like meetups, dates, whatever you would think, on shared bikes, because
Hmm.
that gave them a distance from home and sort of ability to be together and stuff like that. So yeah, if it affects us at that level, then we know we're winning, and people are discovering new jobs for that.
True.
Hard to do with a car, and nowadays anyway in the city.
Yeah. And second data point is that if you look at road biking as a category, so road bicycles as a category, not road bicycles, city bicycles as a category, it's been flat for the last couple of years. And if you look at the leisure category, that's actually growing pretty well the last couple of years.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So this is the job of recreation and
Yeah.
fun, but here's the thing. There's a lot of motorcycling now. This is I observed it from a sort of a legacy point of view. The problem in the U.S. in particular is that motorcycling is a leisure, not a commute activity. Very rarely people commute on motorcycles, which is kind of a strange fact, in my opinion. But nonetheless, it's considered an activity for fun, and so the whole industry now, at least in the U.S., is predicated on it. The beauty of micro, though, is because actually even though you might say, well, that's just an electric bike is nothing more but a tiny, tiny motorcycle.
Yeah.
But the fact is, they're so different in terms of how they're hired for the job, because electric bicycles are far more used in commuting than uh, for utility purposes than for leisure. And
Hmm.
as a result, the leisure motorcycle typically is a weekend thing, and it needs a long range, which is very hard to supply with electric drive. So you have this almost anachronistic use of the motorcycle for with a gasoline engine required for the long trips that you might take on the weekend. And it doesn't electrify easily, even though
Yeah.
naturally it should, because of the job. The job being weekend cruising, then people don't want to buy an electric motorcycle. And if they do, they're going to use it for commuting, which is probably more economically interesting as a category.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to me because, as an engineer or as an economist, you look
Hmm.
at it from the utility and from the functionality and for the capability, and
Yeah.
you ask, why should these things not interchange? And suddenly you realize that you have to have this psychological analysis of behavior to understand that even though they look the same, they're used for completely different purposes. And that's what jobs is. And I think this is why
Yeah.
it's a tough thing to get across. It's almost that you have to hammer it with example after example. So it too doesn't lend itself to definition.
Yeah.
But if you think that way and you're always outcomes oriented, you'll uncover more opportunities and tune your product to do what it's supposed to do better.
Yeah. So, I mean, you saw the sentiment at Micromobility Europe in Brussels. So, the entire industry, has this understanding that we are in a transition phase, and probably the bottom is, behind us, right? For people who are still building in the space, who believe in the space, what's your message for them?
Well, first of all, I used to say this during the times of COVID. I said to survive is to win. You got to survive before you become big, and so persist and focus on uh, uh, achievable goals. Now, it's hard to say this with a straight face in a time when trillions of dollars are being invested in AI, which may not have an economic model. Um, but that's never stopped us because we've had uh, the industries that I spoke of, the PC, the
Yeah.
smartphone, even the automobile, were industries that were, um, early entrance into something that was considered too small to be interesting. It was like almost contempt was the word for them because they were baby industries and lots of money was being invested in the age of the car. Lots of money was being invested in the rail industry. The railroads were the dominant force. And personal computing was IBM and that cohort of big companies that made big machines. And in the smartphone area, it was like the Nokias and the Motorola were the monsters, or AT&T for that matter, even before. So don't be discouraged by the fact that you may seem to be small, undercapitalized, and generally not many people paying attention. That is actually the way you can almost be sure that if you have those things, you're more likely to be successful as a disruptor. um, if everybody's paying attention and throwing lots of money at you, it's probably you're either going to fail.
Yeah.
And I know it's counterintuitive, but in many ways, what that ends up being is sustaining as opposed to disruptive. The much more money is going into self-driving, much more money is going into automotive, electric, much more money is going into uh, uh, even infrastructure for cars and robotics and all that other stuff and obviously AI, all that stack,
Yeah.
and yet those don't end up disrupting. Where's those small companies there? They're all basically big companies spending a lot of money because that's all they have. They have capital and they're going to deploy it. So persistence, humility,
Mhm.
understanding and focus on the job to be done and understanding about helping customers and creating customers is far more important than saying, I've gone zero to hero instantly. And by the way, we work and lots of other failures historically have been, these kind of enormous growth with no substance. So substance first, I believe.
Okay.
Again, maybe I'm wrong, but substance matters. And and so persistence, survival, good money, good cash flow, and those are fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Be patient. The word is be patient for profit. sorry, no, be hungry for profit, be patient for growth.
Yeah,
That's the mantra.
got it. Okay. Uh, Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Horace, and I'm really, really happy that you're back on the pod. We definitely should do this more. And again, thank you so much, Horace, for joining the
You
pod.
bet. Happy to do it again.
Thank you.